The sun had barely touched the tops of the trees when I arrived at the cabin. It was early fall, and the air held that crispness that promised cold nights and clear skies. The gravel road leading to the cabin was narrow and winding, lined by tall pines and maples already blushing with their autumn colors. I parked my old truck at the edge of a small clearing and took a moment to breathe in the quiet. No cars, no voices, just the wind moving through the leaves and the distant call of a lone crow. The cabin itself was simple, made of rough-hewn logs stacked thick and strong. It looked like it had been built decades ago, but still solid, with a stone chimney rising on one side. The front porch creaked softly under my boots as I walked up, the wooden boards weathered and worn but still sturdy. I could smell the faint scent of pine sap and something older, musty wood, the scent of a place that had seen many seasons. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was dim, lit only by the pale morning light filtering through small, dusty windows. The floor was rough planks, cool beneath my feet. I flicked on the small electric lantern on the counter, casting long shadows that made the room seem bigger and emptier than it really was. There was a fireplace built of river stones, cold and unused now. Against one wall stood a small kitchen area, simple shelves, a cast iron stove, a chipped enamel sink. A table with two mismatched chairs sat near the window, and an old couch covered in faded fabric took up one corner. I set my pack down and started unpacking. I had come here for a week alone, looking to escape the noise of the city and the constant pull of my phone and computer. Just me, the cabin, and the woods. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just some quiet and space to think. Outside, the forest stretched deep and wild. The trees stood tall and straight, their trunks thick with moss and lichen. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground, crackling softly underfoot when I stepped outside to gather firewood. I found a pile of dry branches near the back of the cabin, enough to last for several nights if I kept the fire small. The smell of burning wood mixed with the fresh earth and pine filled the air as I lit the stove and prepared a simple meal. That first evening passed without much more than the usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of squirrels, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig. I settled by the fire, reading a worn paperback I'd brought along, feeling the warmth seep into my bones as the shadows danced on the walls. The next day, I decided to explore the area. There was a small dirt path behind the cabin, leading deeper into the woods. It wasn't marked on any map I had, but I figured I could follow it until it ended or I got tired. The forest was thick, and sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden beams. The smell of damp earth and fallen leaves was strong, and I noticed small animal tracks in the mud, raccoons or maybe foxes. I walked for a couple of hours, taking care not to disturb the quiet. The deeper I went, the more I realized how isolated the place was. There were no other cabins or signs of human life for miles, just the endless green and brown of the forest. When I returned, I noticed something odd near the cabin. A few branches were broken off low on a nearby tree, as if someone or something had brushed past. At first, I thought it might have been a deer or a bear, but the breaks were sharp and clean, like they'd been snapped by human hands or claws. I shrugged it off and went inside. That night, as I lay on the couch listening to the wind, I heard a noise outside. It was faint at first, like a soft scrape against the wood of the cabin. I froze, heart beating a little faster. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. Something was moving just beyond the window. I didn't move or make a sound. After a moment, the noise stopped. I waited a while longer before finally convincing myself it was just a branch or a small animal. The next morning, I found more evidence outside. Near the side of the cabin, footprints were pressed into the soft dirt. They weren't large, maybe size 9 or 10, and definitely human. They led around the back and then disappeared into the trees. I felt a chill but told myself it could be another camper or a hiker. Still, the feeling of being watched had settled over me like a heavy blanket. I started taking precautions. I kept the fire going during the day, making smoke and light, hoping it would discourage anyone from coming near. I also found a thick branch outside to keep nearby if needed. The following days passed with increasing tension. Every evening brought new sounds, soft footsteps crunching leaves, the snap of a twig just outside the window, shadows flitting between the trees. I stopped exploring far from the cabin and kept the doors locked tight. One afternoon, I spotted something in the distance, a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line, watching. When I noticed it, the figure disappeared quickly into the woods. I didn't see any face, only a dark shape that moved with purpose. The sight shook me. I had no phone signal out here and no way to call for help if needed. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and rustle put me on edge. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, slow and careful. I grabbed the branch I'd found and sat up, listening. Nothing else came. The next morning, I found a note slipped under the door. The paper was torn from a notebook, and the words were hastily scrawled in pencil. "Leave, now. This place is not safe." My hands trembled as I held the note. Who had left it? Why? I was alone here, at least I thought so. I debated leaving immediately, but something held me back. Maybe it was stubbornness, or the desire to prove to myself that I could handle being alone. I packed a small bag with essentials and planned to leave at first light the next day. But that night, the noises escalated. Heavy footsteps stomped near the cabin, the sound of something banging against the walls. I pressed myself against the door, clutching the branch, waiting for whatever was outside to reveal itself. At dawn, when the first light broke through the trees, the noise stopped. The forest was quiet again. I stepped outside cautiously. The ground was disturbed. Tracks circled the cabin, some large, some small. I saw broken branches, marks on the walls, and an overturned chair on the porch. I didn't hesitate anymore. I grabbed my bag, locked the door behind me, and started walking toward the truck. The forest felt different, heavier somehow, and I kept looking over my shoulder. The walk back to the truck felt longer than before. Every shadow seemed alive. When I finally reached the gravel road, relief flooded through me. I started the engine and drove away, the cabin disappearing behind me like a bad memory. As I left the forest behind, I realized something important. The fear and unease I felt weren't from ghosts or stories. It was something more real, people. Someone else had been there, watching, maybe waiting. That knowledge stayed with me long after I was safe. A reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't made up. They're just out there, in the quiet woods, waiting for someone to come too close. From then on, I never went back to that cabin or any place so isolated without telling someone exactly where I was going. And I never ignored the feeling that sometimes it's better to listen when something tells you to leave. Because survival isn't about courage alone. It's about knowing when to walk away. The old cabin sat deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest road to feel completely cut off from the world. It was the kind of place I had avoided my whole life, but something made me decide to spend a weekend there. The idea was simple. Get away from everything. No phone, no internet, no city noise. Just me and the forest. I thought it would be peaceful, maybe even refreshing. I was wrong. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was already dipping behind the tall trees, casting long shadows over the gravel driveway. The cabin was nothing fancy. Rough wood siding weathered by years of rain and wind, a small porch with a sagging roof, and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in months. I parked my car next to the porch and took a deep breath of the cold, pine-scented air. The smell was sharp and fresh, but it also carried a hint of dampness that made my skin crawl. Inside, the cabin was dim but clean. Dust floated in the slanting sunlight through the grimy windows, landing on cracked floorboards and old furniture covered with faded blankets. The kitchen was small, with a rusted sink and a gas stove that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. There was a single, narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The walls were thin, and the wood creaked with every step. I dropped my backpack by the door and opened the windows to let in some fresh air. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No bird song, no rustling animals. Just the heavy silence of late autumn, like the woods were holding their breath. Outside, the trees stood tall and close, their branches tangled like fingers reaching toward the sky. I decided to set up the fire before dark, so I grabbed some dry wood stacked near the porch and brought it inside. As I started the fire, the cabin grew warmer and the shadows on the walls flickered. The only sound was the crackling of the flames and the occasional pop from the burning logs. I sat down on an old armchair near the fireplace and took out a notebook, thinking I'd write down my thoughts or maybe sketch the view outside. But my hand trembled slightly, and my eyes kept darting to the window, watching the forest edge where the darkness seemed to thicken. I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. It was stupid, I told myself. I was alone, and the forest was empty. But the air felt heavy, like something was just beyond sight. I closed the notebook and leaned back, listening. There was a faint noise, soft scraping, coming from outside, near the porch. I froze, waiting. The sound stopped. I forced myself to stand and walk outside, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the dark, lighting up the leaves and the rough bark of the trees. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. I looked around but saw nothing out of place. No footprints, no broken branches. Just the usual mess of nature settling into the night. I went back inside, locked the door, and drew the curtains. The fire was dying down, and I added more wood, trying to keep the cabin warm. The cold outside was biting through the cracks in the walls, making the temperature drop fast. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and sat close to the fire again. Night fell completely, and the forest became a black wall outside the windows. I tried to focus on the fire and the feeling of safety it gave me, but my mind kept wandering back to that sound. Then I heard it again, the scraping, this time softer but closer, like something was brushing against the porch railing. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. There, just beyond the glass, I saw a shadow move. It wasn't human, not exactly. Too big and low to the ground. Maybe a deer or a bear, but the shape was wrong, too stiff, too deliberate. Stayed still, then vanished behind the trees. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly opened the door. The cold air hit me, sharp and wet with the smell of moss and earth. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of the figure. I checked behind the porch, around the sides, but only found broken twigs and scattered leaves. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak and groan of the cabin made me jump. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and whistling through the cracks. I sat by the fire until it burned out, then wrapped myself in blankets on the old sofa. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on me, but I kept my eyes open. The next day, I decided to explore the woods. I packed some water and snacks and left the cabin behind, telling myself the daylight would clear my head. The forest was thick with trees and bushes, the ground soft underfoot. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, making patches of gold on the mossy floor. I walked for hours, following animal trails and crossing small streams. The forest felt calm, almost welcoming in the daylight. I found a clearing with wildflowers and sat down to rest. The quiet was soothing, and I let myself relax for a moment. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't deer or bear tracks. These were large and flat, too big for any animal around here. They looked human. The prints were fresh, pressed deeply into the soft earth, leading back toward the cabin. My stomach twisted. I followed the trail quickly, heart racing. The trees grew closer together, blocking the sunlight. Soon, I was back near the cabin. The prints circled around it, disappeared near the porch, then vanished into the woods again. Whoever had made them had been close all along. Back inside, I checked the windows and doors again. Nothing was broken, no sign of forced entry. But the footprints told a different story. Someone had been here, near me, watching. The thought made the cabin feel smaller, suffocating. That night, I kept the fire roaring and the door locked tight. I sat in the chair by the flames, my eyes never leaving the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was just outside, waiting. In the early hours, I heard it again. Soft footsteps on the porch. Slow, careful, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I grabbed the flashlight and peered through the curtains. The porch was empty, but then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the trees. No face, just a dark silhouette. Didn't move, didn't blink. It just watched. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. When the sky finally lightened with dawn, the figure was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking. Before leaving, I took one last look at the cabin. It stood quiet and empty, but the shadows under the porch seemed darker than before. The forest was alive again, but it felt different, like it had a secret it wasn't telling. I drove away without looking back. The silence on the road felt like a relief, like I had left something dangerous behind. The cabin stayed there in the woods, waiting for the next person foolish enough to stay the night. And me, I never went back. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear footsteps outside my window. The cabin stood deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest town that cell phones were useless and the road disappeared into dirt and gravel miles back. I had chosen this place to get away, to be alone with the quiet, and to reset after months of stress and endless noise in the city. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden structure with a small porch, a stone fireplace, and a few windows overlooking the thick forest. I'd rented it for a week, planning to spend my days hiking and evenings by the fire, reading or just staring at the dark woods. The first day was peaceful. I arrived around noon, carrying a backpack with all I thought I'd need: food, water, clothes, a few books, and some camping gear. The sun was bright and warm, and the forest around the cabin looked inviting, alive with birdsong and rustling leaves. I unpacked slowly, setting the small things on the kitchen counter and hanging clothes on hooks by the door. Outside, the wind played with the tall pines and maples, and I could hear a distant creek flowing somewhere nearby. That night, the silence pressed in around me. No hum of cars, no chatter of people. Just the occasional call of an owl or the snap of a twig outside. The darkness felt thick and close, like the woods themselves were watching. I made a fire in the stone fireplace, watching the flames flicker and dance. The cabin felt safe, and I reminded myself I was prepared. Still, the quiet was heavier than I expected. On the second day, I decided to explore more of the area. The rental included a trail map, and I set out early, hiking deeper into the forest. The trail wound through dense trees, over roots and rocks, and sometimes alongside the creek I had heard. The air was cool and fresh, and the only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional bird. I kept my phone off, wanting no distractions. As the hours passed, I felt more relaxed. The forest was calming, almost like it had a rhythm I could fall into. But as the day wore on, I noticed something strange. I kept seeing broken branches and disturbed underbrush, as if something large had moved through recently. There were no animal tracks, at least none I could recognize, only odd marks that looked like claws or maybe scraping. I thought it might be a bear, though I hadn't seen or heard anything directly. I tried to push the thought aside and kept walking. Still, a feeling nagged at me. I wasn't alone out there. When I returned to the cabin that evening, the sun was low and the shadows stretched long across the porch. I lit the fire again and cooked some canned stew, watching the flames reflect in the window glass. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, a small habit from years living in the city. The woods seemed quieter now, almost too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me from just beyond the tree line. The third day was the hardest. I woke to the sound of something heavy crashing through the brush near the cabin. It was early, just after dawn, and the light was dim and gray. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. Outside, the trees shook as something moved quickly and roughly. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and moved cautiously to the window. Peering out, I could see tall trees swaying but no clear shape. Whatever it was had disappeared into the forest, but the ground below was freshly disturbed. Leaves torn up and small branches snapped. I spent the morning walking the perimeter of the property, looking for signs. There were definitely tracks, large, deep, and spaced out like someone or something had been walking heavily. I took pictures with my phone, but there was no signal to send them anywhere. When I came back, I noticed the door to the cabin was slightly ajar, though I was sure I had locked it the night before. Panic crept in. I checked everything again. No other signs of forced entry. I told myself maybe I'd just not pushed the door hard enough, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave. I tried to keep busy, cleaning the cabin and organizing my things, but my eyes kept darting to the windows and the forest beyond. The sun disappeared behind thick clouds, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. I lit a fire but didn't feel warm. The woods outside seemed darker, almost alive. That night, the crashing sounds returned. Louder this time, branches breaking, something big moving closer. I sat frozen, the fire burning low. Then came a long, deep growl. Not an animal sound I'd ever heard, something heavier and stranger. My heart hammered. I grabbed a kitchen knife and stayed by the fireplace, eyes glued to the windows. The sounds faded after a while, but I didn't sleep. I kept listening to the night, hearing faint rustling and the occasional snap of twigs. When dawn finally came, the air was cold and still. On the fourth day, I considered leaving. The noises and strange marks made me feel unsafe. But the road was long and tricky to navigate, especially with the recent rain turning dirt to mud. I decided to stay one more day and then leave early the next morning. I spent the day hiking again, this time sticking closer to the cabin. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was overreacting, but every now and then, I caught a glimpse of movement far in the trees, shadows shifting just beyond my sight. I even thought I saw a figure, but when I blinked it was gone. When I got back to the cabin, I found something new. On the porch, there was a pile of rocks stacked carefully, almost like a marker. I hadn't put them there. The arrangement looked deliberate, but I had no idea why anyone would leave something like that. I knocked the pile over, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. That night, I didn't try to sleep in the bedroom. I set up a makeshift bed in the living room, close to the fireplace. I kept the knife and a large stick near me. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. At about midnight, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy steps. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then came scratching at the door, something trying to get in. I grabbed the knife and quietly moved to the door. My hands trembled as I checked the locks. They were all secure. The scratching stopped suddenly. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, listening for any sign of movement outside. In the morning, I checked the porch. The wood was scratched and gouged deeply in places, like claws or maybe nails had torn at it. I took photos, but still no signal to send them anywhere. I knew I couldn't stay. I packed quickly and started the long walk back to the main road. The forest seemed quieter as I went, no sounds following me. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was only trees and sky. When I reached my car, relief washed over me. I locked the doors, started the engine, and pulled onto the highway. Back in town, I reported what had happened to the local ranger station. They listened carefully and said there had been reports of a large, wild animal seen in the area, a big bear or maybe a cougar, but no one knew for sure. They warned me to be careful if I went back. The experience stayed with me for weeks. I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, the strange marks, and the heavy footsteps on the porch. But I also knew I had been lucky. The cabin was just a place in the woods, but the woods were home to things bigger and wilder than me. In the end, I never went back. The forest had its secrets, and I wasn't ready to face them again. But I kept the photos and the memory, a reminder that some places are better left alone, and some silences are louder than any noise. The sun was already low behind the trees when I finally pulled off the narrow dirt road onto the gravel driveway leading up to the cabin. The tires crunched on the loose stones as I eased the old car to a stop in front of the weathered wooden structure. It was an old cabin, plain and sturdy, built from rough-hewn logs stained a deep brown by years of wind and rain. I'd found it on a last-minute listing online, an affordable getaway far from the noise of the city, a place where I could spend a few days alone, unwind, and maybe clear my head. The air was cool and smelled sharp with pine and damp earth. I grabbed my bags and unlocked the creaky door, pushing it open to let in the dimming light. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a small kitchenette in the corner. A worn rug covered part of the wooden floor, and an old couch sat opposite a tiny TV perched on a rickety stand. Dust coated some surfaces, but it felt lived in, not abandoned. I set my things down and walked over to the window. The woods stretched dense and silent, the tops of the tall trees swaying faintly in the evening breeze. The sky was streaked with orange and pink as the sun slipped behind the horizon, the shadows growing longer and darker by the minute. I was glad I'd arrived before full darkness settled in. After unpacking, I lit a fire in the hearth. The crackling flames filled the room with warmth and a soft glow. I cooked a simple dinner, canned beans heated over the stove, some bread I'd brought along, and ate while watching the fire flicker. Outside, the sounds of the forest grew more pronounced. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird settling in for the night, the steady hum of insects. The first night passed quietly. I slept on the creaky bed upstairs, the wooden walls seeming to absorb every sound. Occasionally, the wind pressed against the cabin like a soft whisper, but nothing more. Morning came with gray clouds and a faint drizzle tapping the windows. I made coffee and sat on the porch, wrapped in a sweater, watching the mist curl around the trees. I planned to spend the day hiking nearby trails, exploring the area. The woods were thick and green, branches heavy with moss and dripping with rain. The path underfoot was soft and muddy, marked by the tracks of small animals. I walked slowly, enjoying the smell of wet leaves and pine needles, the peaceful quiet apart from the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots. But as I ventured deeper, a strange feeling began to creep over me. The forest seemed too quiet. The usual chatter of birds and rustling squirrels was missing. Even the wind had died down. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I stopped and looked around. The shadows between the trunks seemed thicker, darker. My skin prickled, and I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself it was just my imagination. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing with a shallow pond, its surface still and mirror-like. I knelt down to splash some water on my face when I heard it. The faintest crunching sound, like footsteps, but slower and heavier than any animal I knew. My heart quickened. I stood up and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. I tried to calm down, convincing myself it was probably another hiker or a deer, but there was no sign of anyone else around. The forest was empty. I decided to head back. The trail back felt longer, the way less familiar somehow. The shadows stretched unnaturally, and the trees seemed to crowd closer, their trunks blotting out the fading daylight. Every crackle of a branch or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. Suddenly, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer and definitely human. I stopped, listening hard. The sound came from behind a thicket, just off the trail. I held my breath. For a moment, silence. Then a faint rustle, like someone moving carefully through the underbrush. I looked but saw nothing. The hair on my arms stood up. I broke into a run, pushing through the trees, dodging low branches, heart hammering. The cabin had never seemed so far away. When I finally stumbled onto the gravel driveway, gasping for breath, the cabin's windows glowed warmly. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and sliding the bolt tight. Inside, the silence was thick. I could hear the fire crackling in the hearth and my own ragged breathing. I checked the windows. Nothing outside but the trees swaying in the wind. I sat down heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself I'd probably imagine the footsteps, maybe a hunter or some hikers. Still, the fear lingered like a shadow. That night, sleep was fitful. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the walls made me jump. I kept the fire burning, its warm light pushing back the darkness outside. The next day, I stayed closer to the cabin, clearing brush from around the porch, collecting firewood. I checked the locks and windows repeatedly. The sense of being watched was hard to shake. Late that afternoon, while gathering wood near the edge of the clearing, I found something that stopped me cold. A pair of muddy footprints, fresh, leading from the woods straight to the cabin. They were large, heavy prints, too big for any animal around here. I followed them back toward the trees. They disappeared into the undergrowth about 50 feet from the cabin. I scanned the area but found nothing else. No other tracks, no broken branches, no sign of whoever had been there. The thought that someone had been so close to me, watching, hiding, unsettled me more than anything else. I gathered my wood quickly and moved inside, locking the door and windows again. I checked my phone, no signal. I felt trapped, alone, and vulnerable. The night after that was worse. I heard noises outside, soft thumps on the roof, scraping sounds along the walls, the faint dragging of something heavy. I stayed inside, silent and tense, clutching a heavy stick I'd found outside earlier. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move just beyond the window. I pressed myself flat against the floor, heart pounding. Morning brought little relief. I debated leaving, but the roads were muddy from the rain, and the car might get stuck if I tried to drive out right away. I tried to convince myself it was just animals or the wind, but deep down, I knew someone had been there, maybe watching me, maybe waiting. That day, I made a plan. I collected every heavy piece of firewood I could find and stacked it by the door. I dug through my bag and found an old hunting knife and a small first aid kit. I kept the fire going all day and night. I sat near the window, eyes scanning the tree line. Around midnight, the noises started again. The scraping on the walls, the thumps on the roof. I stayed quiet and still, trying not to breathe too loud. Then, I heard something else. A low, slow scraping at the back door. It was deliberate, careful. I gripped the knife and edged toward the kitchen, where the back door was. My hands trembled. The scratching stopped. Silence. I waited, listening. Nothing. I slowly peered through the small window by the door. The porch was empty. The shadows were long and twisting in the firelight. Then, in the distance, I caught a glimpse of movement, a dark figure slipping behind a tree. I backed away quickly, locking the door tight. I realized then that someone had been stalking me for days, hiding just beyond the edge of the woods, watching my every move. I knew I couldn't stay. The next morning, before dawn, I packed everything into the car, careful not to make noise. I took one last look at the cabin, its walls scarred by the night scratching, the quiet woods that had held their secrets too close. I drove off the muddy driveway and onto the dirt road. As I left the forest behind, the fear slowly faded. I knew I had been lucky. The cabin was no longer a place of peace, but a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see but can feel breathing just beyond the shadows. I never went back. From that trip on, I chose places where people were around, where the woods weren't so silent, and the shadows didn't feel alive. That cabin taught me something important. Sometimes the wilderness hides more than just trees and animals. Sometimes it hides people who want to stay hidden, watching from the darkness, waiting for the right moment. And the only way to stay safe is to listen carefully, trust your instincts, and never ignore the signs. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. After months of city noise, work stress, and endless deadlines, I finally got a chance to spend a few days alone in a small cabin deep in the woods. The cabin wasn't new, but it was sturdy and stood at the edge of a dense forest near a lake. I rented it for 4 days, wanting nothing but silence and some time to clear my head. I thought I was prepared for anything, except how fast a simple trip could turn into something else. I arrived at the cabin just before dusk. The drive was long and winding, with the asphalt fading into gravel and dirt roads, bordered by thick trees on either side. The sun hung low in the sky, painting everything gold and orange. The fresh smell of pine filled the air, and the sound of birds was everywhere. The cabin was modest. A single room with a little kitchen, a wood stove, and a narrow porch facing the lake. The water looked calm, reflecting the fading light. I parked the car near the cabin and unloaded my bag. The place smelled like old wood and dust, mixed with the faint scent of pine needles. I went inside and set down my things, feeling a wave of peace wash over me. The windows showed the forest all around, thick and still. I stacked some wood for the stove and made a simple dinner on the tiny gas burner, a can of beans warmed with a little butter and bread. As I ate, the sky darkened, and the first stars came out. I opened the windows to let the cool evening air in. The forest outside seemed quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird settling down for the night. The calmness felt good, like a reset button for my mind. Later, I built a small fire in the stove and sat close, the warmth spreading through the room. I read for a while, then lay down on the narrow bed by the window. Outside, the moon had risen, casting pale light over the lake. I could hear water lapping gently at the shore and the faint hoot of an owl somewhere deep in the woods. I had brought a flashlight, extra batteries, and my phone, although the signal was weak here. I told myself everything was fine. I was safe. I had planned this carefully, enough food, water, and basic supplies for emergencies. The only wild thing was the forest, and I knew enough to be cautious. But around midnight, something shifted. The night grew colder, and the sounds of the forest changed. The usual quiet was replaced by a deeper stillness, broken only by occasional twigs snapping nearby. I didn't see anything through the window, but I could feel eyes watching me. It was the kind of feeling that creeps up on you when you're alone, and your mind starts to fill in the gaps. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired. Maybe a deer or some other animal was moving close to the cabin. The forest was alive with wildlife, after all. But the snapping noises came again, closer this time, not far from the porch. I got up slowly and grabbed the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark like a knife, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting my face hard. The beam of light moved slowly around the clearing. I could see footprints in the soft dirt near the porch. They were fresh and big, too big for a deer. They looked like boot prints. I froze. Whoever it was, they had been right outside my cabin. I hadn't heard footsteps at all. My heart beat faster as I scanned the edge of the forest. There was nothing moving, just dark shapes of trees. I went back inside and locked the door. I checked the windows to make sure they were closed. My hands shook a little, but I told myself I was okay. Maybe a hunter had wandered close by. The footprints didn't look threatening, just careless. I sat back down near the stove, trying to calm my breathing. The fire was dying low, but the room felt warmer than outside. I stared at the shadows on the wall and tried to distract myself with my book. But the feeling of being watched stayed. Around 2 a.m, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate tapping on the cabin wall closest to the forest. Not loud, but steady. I didn't move at first, too scared to react. Then the tapping stopped. Silence. I waited a long moment, but nothing else happened. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but no signal. I texted my sister, just saying I was okay and would check in the morning. She replied almost immediately. That helped a little. I kept the flashlight near me all night, sitting in the bed, eyes wide open. When dawn finally came, the first weak light through the windows felt like a blessing. In the morning, I went outside to look around the cabin more carefully. The footprints were gone, washed away by rain overnight. But I found something else near the back of the cabin. A small pile of rocks, stacked carefully in a neat little tower. It looked deliberate, like someone had left a marker. I didn't know what to think, but it felt like a message. I took a photo and put on my jacket. I needed to get out of there, but my car was still parked where I had left it. I felt uneasy leaving the cabin, but worse staying. Before I left, I double-checked all the locks and windows. I packed quickly, trying not to look behind me. On my way to the car, I heard a faint noise, a soft crunch of leaves under heavy boots. I turned fast, shining my flashlight toward the edge of the trees. I saw a shadow move back into the woods. My heart pounded, but I didn't run. I got in the car and locked the doors. The engine started on the first try, and I drove away slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror. The road back was silent, the forest closing in on both sides. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone following me. But no one appeared. When I reached the main highway, I felt the tension ease for the first time since I arrived. I called my sister again, and this time the signal was strong. I told her I was leaving, and she said she'd be waiting for me. The whole trip home was a mix of relief and nerves. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched for days. But I was safe now. The city noise was back, but so was the sense of security. Looking back, I think the scariest part wasn't the noises or the footprints. It was the unknown, knowing someone had been so close but never seen, never caught. No words, no threats, just the silent presence in the dark woods. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was there or why they came so close, but I learned something important. Sometimes the real danger isn't what you see or hear, it's what you don't. The old cabin sat deep in the woods, far off from any road or town. It was a small, weather-beaten building made of rough logs, with a sagging roof and windows clouded by dirt and time. I had found it listed in a local rental guide, a simple place for a quiet weekend away from the city noise, the kind of place where you could be alone with your thoughts, with nothing but trees and the sound of the wind for company. I wanted that, to get away, to clear my head, to escape the busy world for a little while. I arrived late afternoon, the sun hanging low and turning the sky into shades of orange and pink. The forest around the cabin was dense, tall pines crowding close together, their needles whispering in the light breeze. The air smelled fresh and sharp, filled with pine sap and damp earth. Felt clean, like a reset button for my mind. The path to the cabin was rough, barely more than a trail that cars had worn down over the years. When I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, I noticed how still everything was. No birds sang, no squirrels darted about. The silence was deep and heavy, pressing in on me, but I pushed that feeling aside. I was here to relax, not to worry. The cabin door creaked open with a stubborn groan. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and old dust. The floorboards were worn but sturdy, and the walls lined with faded wallpaper peeling at the corners. A small stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold and empty now, but promising warmth once I got a fire going. There was a simple wooden table and 2 chairs, a bed pushed into the far corner with a thin mattress, and a small kitchenette with an old stove and sink. No running water, but a well outside was supposed to provide fresh water. I set my bags down and walked around, running my fingers over the rough wood of the walls, feeling the cabin's history. Someone had lived here before, maybe many people over the years, and all of them had left bits of themselves behind. It felt strange and lonely, but also comforting in a way. A place untouched by time. I spent the next hour gathering wood from a nearby pile and building a fire in the fireplace. The flames flickered and crackled, casting dancing shadows across the cabin's rough interior. Outside, the light faded fast, and soon the forest was plunged into night. The darkness felt complete, almost solid, pressing up against the windows. As the fire burned low, I sat back in the chair and listened. The wind sighed through the trees, and every so often a branch scraped against the cabin's walls. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted. The sounds were natural but unfamiliar, reminding me I was far from any town or neighbors. The silence stretched on, deep and heavy. Around midnight, I decided to check on the water. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The air was colder now, sharp against my skin. The moon was just a thin crescent, barely lighting the path. The trees seemed taller, their shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. I followed the trail to the well, an old stone circle covered in moss and leaves. The water was clear and cold when I dipped my cup in, and I drank deeply. I looked around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. For a moment, I thought I heard something move in the trees, branches snapping softly, a faint rustle like footsteps. I froze and held my breath. The woods were still again. Probably an animal, I told myself. Deer or raccoon maybe. Nothing to worry about. Back inside, I closed and locked the cabin door. I made sure the fire was safely contained, then crawled into the thin bed. The cabin felt colder now, the walls seeming to close in. My mind wandered to all the stories you hear about places like this. People getting lost, strange noises in the night, things lurking just out of sight. I shook the thoughts away. I was alone here, safe, and nothing was going to happen. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise startled me. The creak of the wood as it shifted in the cold, the whisper of wind outside, the soft thump of something heavy falling somewhere beyond the clearing. I kept my flashlight close, ready to grab it if needed. Hours passed in a restless haze. Just before dawn, I heard it, a soft tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. Slow, deliberate, coming from outside the cabin door. My heart hammered. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The tapping stopped, replaced by a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. I wanted to tell myself it was a branch or a rock falling, but the sound was too steady, too purposeful. I lay there frozen, every muscle tense. The scraping moved around the cabin, slow and steady, circling the building. My mind raced with thoughts of someone out there, someone watching me in the dark. After what felt like forever, the noises stopped. The forest fell silent again. I waited a long time, too afraid to move, before finally gathering the courage to peek through the window. The clearing was empty, only the trees standing guard in the pale dawn light. When the sun finally rose, the cold fear started to fade, replaced by a tired relief. I left the cabin door open and stepped outside, scanning the ground for any clues. Near the back, I found a long scratch in the wood of the cabin's logs, fresh and rough, as if someone had dragged a sharp object across it. Not far from that, footprints in the soft dirt led back toward the forest, too big and uneven to be any animal I knew. I packed quickly, eager to leave the cabin behind. As I gathered my things, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the tree line. But there was nothing, just the quiet forest and the morning sun filtering through the leaves. I locked the cabin door one last time and started down the trail toward my car. The forest felt alive with light now, the fear of the night shrinking with every step. The woods were just trees and shadows, nothing more. But I knew I wouldn't forget the quiet tapping or the scraping sounds anytime soon. That night, alone in the cabin, taught me something simple but real. Out there in the wilderness, sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or stories. Sometimes they are the very real, very human shadows you can't see until it's almost too late. Driving away, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The cabin was just a place, but something about it, the silence, the darkness, the unknown presence, had unsettled me deeper than I expected. I promised myself I wouldn't come back, not for a long time, if ever. Some places, I realized, are better left alone. The forest holds its secrets tight, and some things are meant to stay hidden in the dark. The cabin stood at the edge of a dense forest, hidden deep in the mountains where cell phone signals faded away like distant echoes. I had found it through a small online listing, a modest place with a worn wooden porch, a rusted metal roof, and windows clouded with years of grime. The photos showed a simple, quiet retreat, perfect for the solitude I craved. I wanted nothing more than to escape the noise of the city, the constant hum of life, and to spend some time alone, disconnected. I packed my things with care, loaded the car, and set off early on a Saturday morning. The drive itself was long and winding. Highway asphalt gave way to narrow, cracked roads bordered by thick trees. Sunlight filtered through the leaves and patches, creating moving mosaics of light and shadow. Every mile further into the mountains, the air grew cooler and the sounds of civilization faded behind me. The only noises were the distant calls of birds, the rustling of branches, and the soft hum of my engine. As I got closer, I noticed more signs of neglect. Old, faded signs warning of wildlife, abandoned trucks covered in moss, and gravel paths swallowed by weeds. It was as if time here moved differently, slower and less forgiving. I reached the cabin just before noon. It looked smaller in person than it had online, almost fragile against the backdrop of towering pines. The porch creaked underfoot as I stepped out, the boards warped and splintered in places. I set my bags down and took a slow breath, the scent of pine needles and damp earth filling my lungs. The silence was complete. No birdsong, no distant engines, no voices. just the occasional snap of a twig from some unseen animal moving in the underbrush. The door opened with a groan, revealing the interior. A single room with a small kitchen in one corner, a wood stove against the far wall, and a rickety table surrounded by mismatched chairs. The floor was uneven, with dusty floorboards that moaned with every step. The windows were thick with dirt and cobwebs, but the weak sunlight still managed to shine through. A musty smell hung in the air, a mix of old wood, dampness, and forgotten memories. I set about making the place livable. First, I opened all the windows to air out the cabin. The breeze swept in, carrying the forest's fresh scent inside. I wiped down surfaces, stacked some dry wood by the stove, and checked the small fridge, which was still humming quietly despite the power being off. The place had no electricity, no running water, exactly what I wanted. I was ready to be self-sufficient, to live simply for a few days. For the next few hours, I wandered around the property. There was a small clearing behind the cabin, ringed by tall trees, where the sunlight poured down in golden pools. I noticed footprints near the back door. Some looked fresh, others older and more faded. Mostly animal tracks, I assumed. Deer, raccoons, maybe a coyote or two. The forest beyond was thick and dark, the trees growing close together with little undergrowth, as if the shadows themselves kept the floor clear. Birds flitted from branch to branch, and every so often I caught sight of a squirrel or rabbit darting away from my footsteps. Night, things changed. The forest became a different place after dark. Heavier, thicker, almost oppressive. The silence was no longer peaceful but thick with unseen presence. I had brought a lantern and some candles, but their light felt weak against the vast darkness pressing in through the windows. I made a small fire in the wood stove to warm the room and settled in with a book. The flickering flames cast long shadows that danced along the walls, twisting and shifting in ways that made me uneasy. Every snap and crackle of burning would seem amplified, breaking the silence with sudden bursts. I heard the first sound late that night, a faint scraping, like claws dragging across wood. It was slow and deliberate, coming from just outside the cabin. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some small animal. I stayed still, listening. The noise stopped after a moment, but my skin felt prickly, as if unseen eyes were watching me. Sleep was difficult. The bed was old and creaked with every movement. Outside, the wind rustled through the branches, making the trees sway and groan. Every few minutes, I heard more noises. A distant thump, the shuffle of feet on leaves, or the sharp snap of a broken twig. I kept a flashlight by the bed and stayed awake, waiting, alert. The next day, I explored more. I followed a narrow trail leading away from the cabin, deeper into the forest. The path twisted through thick ferns and moss-covered rocks, the canopy above blocking much of the sky. Sunlight barely reached the ground. I noticed more signs: broken branches at odd angles, disturbed patches of dirt, and animal droppings. There was something off about the trail. It felt like it was being used, but not by the usual forest animals. As the afternoon wore on, the sky grew cloudy and the air took on a heavier feel. I turned back, eager to get inside before dark. The forest seemed quieter now, almost too quiet. The usual sounds of birds or rustling leaves were gone. A heavy stillness settled around me, like the forest was holding its breath. Back at the cabin, I made a simple dinner of canned beans and bread. I ate slowly, keeping the lantern close. As night fell, the scraping sound returned, louder this time, circling the cabin like something was pacing just beyond the walls. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was an animal looking for food, but the noise was too steady, too intentional. Sleep eluded me again. I sat by the stove, my eyes darting to the windows every few seconds. Outside, the darkness seemed to pulse and shift, shadows moving where no light should be. The scraping became scratching, then pounding. At one point, I saw a faint outline through the grimy glass. A figure standing just beyond the porch, barely visible in the dim light of the moon. My breath caught. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a heavy metal flashlight, and moved cautiously to the door. I hesitated, fingers trembling on the latch. I could hear heavy breathing just outside, slow and labored. I opened the door a crack and shone the light outward. Nothing. The forest was empty. No figure, no movement. Only the soft rustling of leaves. I locked the door quickly and bolted it with a wooden chair. My heart pounded in my chest, my body slick with sweat. I sat back down and tried to steady my breathing. Whoever or whatever had been there was gone for now, but I knew it would come back. The next morning, I found fresh footprints around the cabin. Large, heavy prints, too big for any animal I knew. They circled the porch, stopped at the door, then vanished into the trees. I felt a sinking feeling in my chest, a cold weight of fear I couldn't shake. I packed what I could and decided to leave. I wasn't willing to spend another night in that place. But when I tried to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead, or worse. The radio was silent, and my phone showed no signal. Trapped. I thought about hiking out, but the forest was vast and unfamiliar. Without proper supplies or a clear trail, it could take days. I wasn't prepared to spend that much time out there, not with something lurking nearby. As night fell again, the noises started anew, louder and closer. Scratching at windows, pounding on walls, heavy footsteps circling the cabin. I kept my flashlight ready, my ears straining for any sound of rescue or escape. Then I heard the voice. Not spoken words, but a low, guttural growl, mixed with heavy breathing. It was a sound from something alive but terrifyingly close to human, or maybe not quite human. The pounding became frantic, desperate, and I realized it wasn't just some wild animal or prankster. It was someone or something trapped and angry. I spent the entire night huddled in the corner, the flashlight shining out into the dark, ready to defend myself. When dawn finally came, the pounding stopped. The forest was silent once again. I checked the car, and miraculously, it started on the second try. I didn't look back as I drove down the mountain, the cabin disappearing behind me in the morning mist. Later, I learned from the locals that the area had a history of squatters and desperate people hiding out in the woods. Some fleeing the law, others lost or broken by their lives. Sometimes, those people would come close to the cabins, searching for food or shelter. The footprints, the noises, the figure I saw, all signs of someone else struggling in the dark, trying to survive. It wasn't a ghost or fairy tale creature, just a harsh reality of isolation, desperation, and fear in the wilderness. I never went back. The cabin stayed empty, a silent reminder that some places, no matter how peaceful they seem, hold more than just quiet trees and fresh air. They hold the echoes of lives fraying at the edges, desperate to be seen, and sometimes dangerous to encounter. I was lucky to get out when I did. The forest took back its silence. I didn't expect the trip to be like that. I had been planning a simple weekend away to clear my head. Just me, the woods, and a small cabin I rented deep in the mountains. I wanted silence, fresh air, and a break from the city noise. The kind of place where the nearest neighbor is miles away, where cell service is spotty at best, and the biggest problem is making sure you have enough firewood. I had been there once before, a couple of years ago, and everything went smooth. The cabin was small but cozy, built from old pine logs with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a small bed, and a porch that looked out over a clearing surrounded by thick forest. The road was rough but passable in a regular car if you took it slow. The last few miles I drove alone, winding up a narrow gravel path lined by thick trees. The air smelled fresh and a little damp from the recent rain. The sun was starting to lower, casting long shadows through the branches. I remember feeling a sense of calm as I pulled up and saw the cabin resting quietly among the tall pines. It looked just as I remembered, weathered but sturdy, with a thin plume of smoke curling up from the chimney. Inside, I unpacked quietly, setting out my supplies for the next couple of days. Food, water, a stack of firewood I brought in, a lantern, a book, and some clothes. I like to keep it simple. I built a fire in the fireplace, and as the flames cracked and warmed the small room, I settled in to read. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. It was peaceful, But as night fell, the feeling changed. Not in a scary way at first, just quieter. The forest sounds, the birds, the squirrels, the distant river, faded until only the rustling leaves and the occasional snap of a twig remained. I shut the windows against the chill and sat close to the fire, feeling the heat on my face. The cabin was warm, but there was a coolness just outside that made the wooden floorboards creak now and then. Later, I stepped outside to grab more firewood stacked near the back porch. The moon was low and partially hidden by clouds, and the trees cast long, shifting shadows. The air smelled like pine and earth and something wet. The ground was soft and uneven underfoot, leaves and pine needles muffling my steps. I had brought a small flashlight, but I didn't want to use it much. I trusted my eyes to adjust to the dark. That's when I noticed something odd. Off in the distance, beyond the clearing, I thought I saw a faint light moving among the trees. At first, I thought maybe a hunter or someone else staying nearby, but I knew the nearest road was miles away. There were no other cabins for at least half a mile in any direction. The light wasn't steady like a flashlight beam. It flickered and shifted, almost like a candle or a small lantern being carried slowly. I stood still and watched for a moment, but it disappeared behind a thick cluster of trees. The woods were dense here, and the shadows shifted quickly. My heart started to beat a little faster. I reminded myself that it was probably just a deer reflecting my flashlight or a trick of the light. Still, I kept my back to the cabin and looked carefully. Nothing else moved. I went back inside and locked the door. I didn't mention the light to anyone. There was no one to mention it to, but it stayed in my mind as I went to bed. I slept lightly, waking often to the creaks and groans of the cabin settling in the cold night. The next day, I went out for a walk along the small trail behind the cabin. The sun was higher now, warm on my skin through breaks in the trees. I liked the way the light came through the leaves, casting patterns on the dirt path. I found a small stream, clear and cold, where I refilled my water bottle. The forest was alive with birdsong and the buzz of insects. I felt better, but the feeling of being watched didn't fully go away. As I walked back to the cabin, I noticed something else. Strange footprints in the soft dirt near the porch. They were large and uneven, not the usual animal prints. I bent down to look closely. The prints were deep, as if whoever made them was heavy, but the shape was strange, almost like a boot with a thick sole, but with some uneven edges. I didn't recognize them. I looked around carefully, but there was no sign of anyone. No other tracks, no broken branches or leaves crushed underfoot. Just these prints leading from the edge of the forest to the cabin and back again, like someone had been pacing near the porch. That unsettled me. I checked the windows and doors. They were all closed and locked. Nothing looked disturbed inside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood, chopping logs, and preparing for the night. The sun dropped again, and the shadows grew long. I built a larger fire in the pit outside and sat nearby, watching the flames. The forest was silent except for the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then I heard it, a soft sound, like a slow, deliberate step on dry leaves behind me. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I slowly turned my head, shining my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness and shadows. I kept the fire going and stayed close. The night stretched on with no more noises, but the tension didn't leave me. On the third day, I noticed something else strange. My food supplies were lighter than they should have been. I had carefully counted what I brought, and it didn't add up. Some of the bread I kept wrapped in plastic had been torn open and half-eaten. I was careful to keep everything sealed in containers and inside the cabin. How had something gotten in? I checked the cabin thoroughly. Doors and windows were locked. There was no sign of forced entry. The only way in seemed to be the main door or windows. None showed any damage. I began to think maybe an animal, like a raccoon or a squirrel, had found a way in through a small crack or gap somewhere. But I couldn't find any hole big enough. That night, I left the cabin door locked but unlatched, just in case. I slept with the lantern lit and ready beside my bed. I didn't hear any noises, but I didn't sleep well either. On the fourth day, I decided to leave early. The The peace I sought was gone, replaced by a steady, creeping unease. I packed quickly, clearing out the cabin, stacking firewood back, and putting trash in bags to take with me. As I was about to leave, I heard a noise from the woods behind the cabin. It was loud and sharp, like the snap of a heavy branch underfoot. I stopped and turned, shining my flashlight into the trees. My heart was pounding. There, about 50 feet away, I saw a figure standing between the trees. At first, it was just a dark shape, but then I saw it clearly. A man, wearing a dark jacket and boots, his face half hidden by shadows. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching. I didn't call out or shout. I didn't want to startle him. Instead, I slowly stepped back toward the cabin, keeping my eyes on him. He didn't follow. He just stood still and disappeared into the woods after a few seconds. I didn't wait around. I jumped into my car and drove off as fast as I could, the gravel road kicking up dust behind me. The weight in my chest only eased once I was back on the main road, with other cars passing and cell signal returning. Later, when I got home, I called the local ranger station and told them what happened. They told me the area was known for illegal hunters and squatters who sometimes used abandoned cabins. They warned me to be careful and to report anything suspicious. The whole experience stayed with me, making me appreciate the safety and noise of the city more than ever. The forest is beautiful, but it's also wild, and sometimes wild means danger. Not ghosts or monsters, but people who don't belong, who hide and watch. I don't regret going to the cabin, but I won't be going back anytime soon. The quiet can hide things you don't want to find, and sometimes the scariest part of the woods is not what's out there in the trees, but what's waiting quietly just beyond the clearing. The sun was already low in the sky when I pulled onto the gravel road leading to the cabin. The air smelled sharp with pine and damp earth, the forest thick and silent on both sides of the narrow path. I had been driving for hours, leaving behind the noise and rush of the city, craving the quiet that only a remote place could offer. The cabin was supposed to be a simple refuge, a place to clear my mind and get away from everything. But from the moment I saw the peeling paint and sagging porch, I knew this weekend would be different from the peaceful escape I had imagined. The cabin stood alone in a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees that swayed slightly in the cold breeze. The windows were dusty and dim, the kind of glass that made the inside look shadowed even when the sun was out. The wooden steps creaked as I climbed up and pushed open the heavy door. Inside, the air was stale and smelled faintly of mold and old wood. The floorboards were warped and uneven, and dust covered most surfaces. It was clear no one had been here in a long time. I dropped my bags on the cracked floor near the door and flicked on the flashlight I had brought. The cabin was small, just one room that served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom all at once. A rusty old stove sat in the corner, alongside a battered sink with peeling paint around the edges. A small table leaned slightly to one side, and two rickety chairs stood by it. The bed was just a thin mattress on a wooden frame, covered by a faded blanket. I pulled back the curtains to let in what little light was left, revealing cobwebs in the corners and a thick layer of dust on every surface. I had chosen this place because it was cheap and off the grid. No cell service, no internet, no distractions. I wanted to disconnect, to be alone with my thoughts. But as the last rays of sun disappeared behind the trees, the isolation started to feel heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I set about making the place a little more livable. I cleaned the dust off the table, swept the floor with an old broom I found in the corner, and checked the stove. It was cold and rusty but seemed intact. I had brought canned food, bottled water, and a small portable heater just in case the temperature dropped too low. As night fell, I lit a couple of candles and sat by the window, watching the forest darken into a black silhouette against the sky. The silence was absolute. No cars, no animals, no wind. Even the usual night sounds seemed muffled. I thought about how far I was from the nearest town, how alone I really was. A few hours passed, and I felt the first tug of unease. It wasn't fear exactly, more a creeping sense of being watched, of something waiting just beyond the trees. I tried to shake it off and went to bed early. The mattress was hard and uncomfortable, and the cabin was colder than I expected. I wrapped myself in the thin blanket and stared at the ceiling, the faint flicker of candlelight casting strange shadows on the walls. Every creak of the wood made me jump. Every rustle outside set my heart racing. But sleep finally came. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a noise. It was faint, almost like scratching or dragging, coming from outside. I lay still, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a raccoon or a deer moving through the underbrush. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and shone it toward the window. The beam sliced through the darkness, catching the outline of trees and thick bushes. Nothing moved. I forced myself to lie back down. Maybe it was nothing, but my mind wouldn't settle. I kept hearing small noises, twigs snapping, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, like someone or something was moving just outside the clearing. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but the thought of driving back in the dark on unfamiliar roads made me stay. By morning, the unease had turned into something heavier. I went outside to inspect the area around the cabin. The ground was damp from last night's rain, and the forest floor was littered with leaves and pine needles. Near the edge of the clearing, I noticed disturbed earth. Small patches where the soil looked freshly turned over, like something had been digging. There were no footprints, just these strange marks. I took a picture with my phone, though I knew I wouldn't have signal out here to send it anywhere. The rest of the day passed slowly. I chopped some firewood from a fallen branch, carried water from the small creek nearby, and explored the edges of the forest. The deeper I went, the darker and tighter the trees became, until it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I felt exposed and vulnerable, the kind of feeling you get when you realize you're not in control. I found an old trail, overgrown and unused, and wondered where it led. That night, I made a fire in the rusty stove. The warmth was welcome, but the flames threw flickering shadows against the walls, making the cabin seem alive in a way that made me uneasy. The noises came back, this time louder, closer. A scraping sound on the wood outside, a low rustling, like something brushing against the cabin walls. I sat frozen, staring at the door, willing myself to be brave. Then, I heard it, something heavy hitting the outside wall, a sharp thud. I jumped up, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight. I moved to the door and looked through the peephole. Nothing. The night was still and black, with no sign of movement. I opened the door a crack, shining the light around the clearing. A pile of rocks had been stacked near the front steps. I hadn't seen them there before. The stones looked deliberately placed, as if someone wanted me to see them. Cold knot formed in my stomach. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to every sound, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. When dawn finally came, I packed a small bag with essentials and decided to hike out before things got worse. I didn't want to spend another night there. As I left the cabin, I noticed more signs. Strange symbols scratched into the bark of trees, twigs arranged in patterns on the ground. Whoever had been here before me left these marks. Maybe they were warnings or messages. I didn't want to stick around to find out. The hike back was exhausting but felt safer than the cabin. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the forest remained quiet. When I finally reached the gravel road, I breathed a deep sigh of relief and headed for my car. Back on the highway, the city lights felt warm and inviting. I couldn't wait to be back in my apartment, surrounded by noise and people. The cabin was nothing like the peaceful retreat I had imagined. It was a place that held something dark and unsettling, something human but unknown. I never went back, and I never told anyone about what I found. The experience stayed with me. Not a ghost story or fairy tale, but a real and raw reminder of how small and vulnerable we can be when cut off from the world. The forest hides many things, and some of them are better left alone. The sky was still a deep blue when I arrived at the cabin, the kind of blue that wraps around the edges of the night before the sun breaks free. I had driven for hours, winding through the quiet roads flanked by thick trees that towered on either side, their leaves whispering in the light evening breeze. The air smelled like pine and wet earth, a clean smell that felt almost sharp in my nose after the long ride through city traffic and exhaust fumes. I pulled off the narrow gravel road onto a short dirt path that led up to the cabin, the tires crunching on loose stones. It was a small wooden structure, tucked between a handful of tall firs, old but well cared for, with dark stains from rain and time on the logs that made it blend naturally into the forest. I stepped out of the car, shut the door with a soft thud, and stretched my legs. The sun was slipping lower behind the mountain ridges, casting long shadows that crept through the trees and blanketed the ground in patterns of light and dark. My backpack felt heavy on my shoulders, stuffed with food, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, some extra clothes, and a thin blanket. I locked the car and headed to the cabin door, where the metal handle was cold under my fingers. The cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and something earthy, like moss growing on rocks nearby. I stepped inside. Inside was simple. A small kitchen corner with a stove that looked old but clean, a wood-burning fireplace with a stack of logs nearby, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed pushed against the far wall with a thin mattress and a patchwork blanket folded at the foot. The windows were clear but smudged with dirt and spider webs, letting in the last light of day and showing the dark forest beyond. I set my bag down, took a deep breath, and moved to open the windows for fresh air, feeling the cool breeze drift in, carrying the faint sound of leaves rustling and distant birds. The plan was to stay the weekend, to get away from everything, the noise, the people, the city that never really felt like home. This cabin was off the grid. No electricity, no cell signal, nothing but the woods and the silence. I liked that kind of quiet sometimes. It gave space to think, to breathe. After unpacking, I started a fire in the fireplace. It took longer than I expected. The wood was damp from last night's rain, and smoke curled thickly before the flames caught properly. I pulled out a small metal kettle from my bag, filled it with water from a jug I'd brought, and set it on the stove to boil. The soft hiss and crackle of the fire filled the cabin, and I sat near it, warming my hands and feeling the heat seep into my bones. Outside, the sun vanished, and the forest darkened, the shadows deepening into thick black. That first night, I slept restlessly. The bed creaked whenever I shifted. The wooden walls seemed to sigh in the wind, and outside, the sounds of the forest were strange and unfamiliar. Owls hooted somewhere far off, and the branches scraped against the cabin like dry fingernails. I was alone, and that alone felt bigger than I was used to. But I told myself it was normal, just nature doing its thing. Morning came slow and soft, sunlight filtering through the trees like spilled gold. I brewed coffee on the stove and ate some canned beans. The forest outside looked calm and quiet in the early light, but as the day went on, I felt a growing unease I couldn't explain. Maybe it was just being alone, or maybe the way the cabin sat so deep in the woods, cut off from the world. Whatever it was, I tried not to let it get to me. I decided to explore. I took a backpack with water and a knife, walked down the dirt path that led from the cabin into the woods. The trees closed in tightly on either side, the path narrow and tangled with roots and fallen leaves. The deeper I went, the darker it got, even in daylight, the thick canopy blocking much of the sun. Birds flitted overhead, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. Every now and then, I stopped to catch my breath or listen. That afternoon, I came across an old hunting trail, barely visible, covered with broken branches and moss. I followed it, curious where it might lead. The forest was so dense here that the air felt cooler, damper. There were patches of mud, and I noticed footprints, some human, some deer. The human prints were fresh, the edges still sharp in the soft earth. That made me pause. The nearest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen a soul on the way in. I didn't feel threatened, but the presence of someone else so close unsettled me. I turned back toward the cabin, walking faster now, scanning the woods around me. The silence felt thicker. I kept hearing faint noises, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. But whenever I looked, nothing was there. It was just the forest moving, I told myself. I reached the cabin as the sun dipped low, its last rays barely touching the treetops. I locked the door behind me and checked the windows. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. That night, sleep was even harder to come by. I heard footsteps outside, soft but deliberate, circling the cabin. At one point, a branch cracked sharply, close enough to make me jump. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it outside, but all I saw were shadows dancing between the trees. I kept the fire burning as long as I could, watching the flames for comfort. When the fire finally died down, I wrapped myself tightly in the blanket, listening to the night sounds, alert and tense. The next morning, I found fresh footprints around the cabin's perimeter. They were too large and deep for an animal, and they didn't match mine. They were human footprints. Whoever had been there had come very close. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I thought about packing up and leaving, but something held me back. Maybe curiosity, maybe stubbornness. I spent the day fixing things around the cabin, stacking more firewood, cleaning the stove, trying to keep my mind busy. The forest seemed quieter now, almost too quiet. No birds, no rustling. The silence was heavy, pressing in. I kept hearing faint noises, voices maybe, but when I stopped to listen, all was still. That evening, I sat by the fire, trying to stay calm. The footsteps came again, louder and slower this time, circling the cabin's edge. I heard a low thud on the roof, like something heavy landing. I didn't want to look, but I knew I had to. I grabbed the flashlight, moved to the window, and shone it outside. A figure stood just beyond the trees, barely visible in the fading light. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I stayed frozen, watching as the figure didn't move, just stood there staring at the cabin. The light flickered as the fire died down. Then, slowly, the figure turned and vanished into the woods. I waited a long time before moving or speaking, but nothing more came. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the dying fire, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. When dawn finally broke, pale and thin, I decided it was time to leave. I packed quickly, checking the doors and windows twice. Outside, the forest was calm again, the strange presence gone. As I drove away, I kept looking back toward the trees, half expecting to see that figure watching from the shadows. But there was nothing there, only the quiet forest reclaiming the space. Back in my city apartment, the silence felt strange and small compared to the vast, dark woods. But I was safe. The cabin was behind me, a place where the quiet was deeper than I'd ever known, and where something or someone had shared the night with me, unseen but unmistakably real. I didn't go back. The cabin stayed in my memory, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but the unknown people and quiet shadows that live just beyond the edges of our comfort. And sometimes, that's enough to make you want to leave the woods behind and never look back. The sky was a dull gray when I pulled off the main road and onto the narrow dirt track that led to the cabin. The whole trip had been planned on a whim, a break from the noise and rush of the city. A few days alone, just me and the woods. I hadn't been to this part of the forest before, but the map showed a small lake and a cabin for rent a few miles in. It was the kind of place that looked perfect in pictures. Old wooden walls, a stone chimney, a porch with a faded rocking chair. I told myself it was exactly what I needed. Quiet, isolation, time to think. The tires crunched over fallen leaves and scattered twigs as I drove deeper down the path. The trees grew thicker, their tall trunks stretching like dark pillars on both sides, blocking out most of the light. I parked next to the cabin, the engine ticking as it cooled, the scent of pine and wet earth filling the air. The place smelled old but solid. I grabbed my backpack and stepped out, feeling the chill of early autumn brushing against my skin. The cabin door creaked as I opened it. Inside, the smell was a mix of old wood and something faintly musty. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped in. Sunlight filtered weakly through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the room. A small kitchen was off to the left, with a rusty stove and a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. To the right, a living area with a worn sofa and a rickety table. I dropped my bag and looked around. No electricity, no Wi-Fi, no phone signal. Just raw, quiet space. I unpacked my things slowly. A lantern, some canned food, bottled water, a small first aid kit, a thick blanket. I had planned for this. The isolation meant no distractions, but also meant I had to be careful. I checked the fireplace. The chimney looked clear. I gathered some dry wood from a small pile outside, broken branches and bits of bark, enough for a fire to keep me warm tonight. The sun sank lower as I stacked the wood and lit the fire. Flames crackled, throwing flickering light onto the rough walls. I sat close, watching the sparks rise and fade, feeling the warmth spread through the room. Outside, the forest whispered with the wind. The occasional bird call cut through the silence. As the evening deepened, I set about exploring the cabin more carefully. The floor creaked unevenly, and the windows rattled with the occasional gust. A small bedroom off the back held a simple bed with a threadbare mattress and a faded quilt. I opened the old dresser. Some clothes left behind, mostly moth-eaten and dusty. No one seemed to be living here. The place was quiet but not abandoned for long. It had the feeling of being forgotten slowly, piece by piece. I ate a simple meal, beans warmed on the stove and a can of peaches. I kept the lantern lit, the fire burning low but steady. Outside, the darkness pressed in thick and heavy. The stars were bright but scattered, the moon a thin sliver. The woods were alive with sounds. The rustle of animals moving through leaves, the snap of a branch breaking somewhere in the distance. I tried not to focus on those noises too much. When the fire finally died down, I wrapped myself in the blanket and lay on the bed, the thin mattress pressing into the wooden frame. The quiet was overwhelming. I stared at the ceiling, noticing the cracks and stains from years of weather. Outside, the wind picked up and sighed through the trees. It wasn't a comforting sound. It was the sound of something ancient and indifferent, reminding me how small I was out here. Sleep came slow. Every creak and whisper pulled me from rest. I kept thinking about the forest beyond the cabin walls. How easy it would be to lose my way, how dark and silent it could get, how little separated me from the vast wilderness. At some point in the night, I woke to a sharp noise. It was different from the usual wind or animal sounds. Something heavier, deliberate. I sat up quietly, listening hard. Footsteps, slow and uneven, outside the cabin. They stopped near the window. I froze, heart pounding, watching the darkness through the glass. There was nothing visible. Maybe an animal, maybe someone walking by, but the steps moved away, retreating into the blackness. I told myself it was nothing, just a deer or a raccoon, but the fear lingered, a cold weight in my chest. Morning light was a relief. I got up, lit the fire again, and prepared a simple breakfast. I told myself to stay calm, to keep busy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not physically, but like the forest was watching, waiting. I spent the day walking around the lake nearby. The water was still and clear, reflecting the trees perfectly. No one else was around. The forest was beautiful but intimidating, thick with fallen leaves, tangled branches, and dense undergrowth. The quiet was deeper here, like a heavy blanket smothering every sound. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The small pile of wood I had left outside had been disturbed. Some logs were shifted, broken twigs scattered. Not like a natural mess from wind or animals. It was deliberate. Someone had been here, or maybe something. The thought hit me hard. The isolation wasn't just from the city. This place held secrets. People came here too sometimes. Maybe hunters or campers or worse. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, even though they were old and creaky. I made sure the fire was burning strong. I set the lantern on the table. I sat down, trying to steady my nerves. That night was worse. The noises outside grew louder. Footsteps again, this time circling the cabin. Branches snapped closer. Something brushed against the wall. The fire flickered dangerously low. I kept a baseball bat close, ready for anything. At one point, the lantern's light dimmed and went out. The cabin was plunged into total darkness. My breathing filled the silence, sharp and quick. I fumbled with matches, struck one finally, and the tiny flame flared up. Outside, a shadow moved just beyond the window. My heart jumped so hard I thought it might burst. But when I looked directly, there was nothing there. Just the black forest, silent and still. I stayed awake all night, the bat in my hands, the fire slowly dying. The fear was real and thick, but I refused to give in to panic. I had prepared for this. I had to keep calm, keep watch. Morning brought relief, but also a strange calm. The forest felt quieter, emptier. The sky was pale blue, the sun weak but steady. I packed up my things carefully, checked the cabin once more, and stepped outside. I didn't see anyone else on the path back, no signs of other people. Just the usual forest sounds, birds, wind, distant water. The cabin faded behind me as I walked back to the car. On the drive home, I thought about the whole trip, the beauty and the silence, the fear and the isolation, the strange feeling of being watched by something unseen. But I also felt stronger for facing it. The forest hadn't broken me. I hadn't given in to panic. I knew now how fragile safety was out here, how easily it could be taken away. The cabin was just a place. The woods were just trees and animals and shadows. And I was just someone who had walked through it, survived, and come out the other side. That was enough. The moment I pulled off the gravel road and onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, the air changed. It wasn't colder or anything, but the quiet pressed in on me like a thick blanket. I had driven for hours, leaving the small town behind and heading into the deep woods where cell service died and the world felt forgotten. My plan was simple: spend a weekend alone at the cabin my uncle had left me, unwind, and escape the noise of city life. I'd never stayed there before, never even been close. But now, with the old rusty gate creaking as I pushed it open and the sun dipping low behind the trees, I knew this place was real in a way I hadn't expected. The cabin stood alone on a small clearing surrounded by thick pine and oak trees, their trunks tall and dark in the fading light. The wood was weathered and gray, with some boards warped or cracked. A stone chimney rose crookedly on one side, and a narrow porch wrapped around the front with a broken rocking chair tipped on its side. The ground was littered with dry leaves, pine needles, and scattered bits of bark. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the porch, the dry leaves crunching under my boots. The air smelled sharp, full of earth and cold pine resin. Inside, the cabin was small but sturdy. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the windows were dusty and streaked, letting in the last light of day. There was a fireplace with a metal grate filled with old ashes, a small wooden table, a couple of rickety chairs, and a narrow bed against the far wall covered with a faded quilt. The kitchen corner had a cast iron stove, a sink with no running water, and some rusty utensils hanging on hooks. I set my bag down, pulled out a flashlight and some supplies I had brought: bottled water, canned food, a small first aid kit, and a battery-powered lantern. I had learned to come prepared. No electricity here, no running water, no phone signal, just the woods and the silence. As night fell, the forest around the cabin thickened into shadows. I lit the lantern and settled in by the fireplace, stacking some dry wood I'd found near the back of the cabin. I managed to get a small fire going, the flames crackling and throwing flickering orange light on the walls. The cabin felt warm, but the dark outside was heavy. I ate some canned beans heated over the stove and drank water slowly. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. I tried to rest early. Tomorrow, I planned to explore the woods, maybe find a trail or a creek nearby. But just as I lay down on the bed, I noticed something odd, faint sounds coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind through the trees, but the noises were too irregular. There was a soft thud against the cabin wall, then a scrape, like something being dragged. My heart sped up, and I sat still, listening. The fire's light flickered against the walls as the noises continued. Closer now. I stayed silent, trying to make sense of it. Suddenly, a low, dragging sound came from the back of the cabin, near the woods. It wasn't heavy like a fallen branch, but slower, deliberate. The smell of something damp and earthy seemed to seep through the cracks in the cabin walls. I felt a chill run down my spine, but reminded myself I was alone and safe inside. Whatever it was, it hadn't come inside yet. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the small window at the back. Shining the beam through the glass, I saw nothing but darkness and tree trunks. Then, a faint glint caught the light. Something shiny on the ground, like metal. My pulse quickened. I wasn't expecting anyone else out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I checked the place thoroughly before nightfall. I didn't hear any cars, footsteps, or voices. The sound stopped. Silence settled back over the forest, heavier than before. I sat back down, forcing myself to calm down and think rationally. Maybe an animal, I told myself. A deer dragging a branch? But the metallic glint was strange, and the dragging noise didn't sound like hooves or claws. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the dirty windows. The forest outside looked peaceful and green, birds singing in the distance. But I hadn't slept well. I kept thinking about last night's sounds and the metal object near the cabin. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area. The ground was damp with dew, and the air smelled fresh. Near the back of the cabin, I found the object. A small, rusted metal box half buried under some leaves and pine needles. I knelt down, brushing off dirt and debris. The box was locked with a heavy padlock, but its edges were rough, corroded. I tried lifting it, but it was surprisingly heavy. My mind raced with questions. Why was it here? Was it dropped or left on purpose? I took the box inside, setting it on the table. I examined it closely, noticing scratches and dents, signs of long neglect. I didn't have the tools to open it, but I planned to try later. The rest of the day I spent exploring the woods. The trees were thick and close, the ground covered with ferns and moss. I found animal tracks, deer, raccoon, maybe a coyote. A small creek trickled nearby, its water clear and cold. The forest was peaceful, but the sense of being watched lingered. I didn't see anyone, but I felt eyes on me, a constant weight pressing in. Back at the cabin, the sun was dipping again when I heard movement in the woods, a crunching of branches as something large moved slowly. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the darkening trees. No animals ran off, no sounds of flight, just the heavy, steady rustle. I walked around the perimeter, shining light everywhere. Then I noticed footprints, large, heavy, fresh. They led from the woods right up to the back of the cabin. I followed them carefully, feeling more uneasy by the minute. The prints stopped near the spot where I found the metal box. Inside the cabin, I sat staring at the box, now more than just a curiosity. I kept hearing noises outside, the forest alive with hidden things. I set traps around the cabin with wire snares and sharp sticks, not expecting to catch anything but hoping to know if something came close at night. That night, I kept the fire going and sat with a knife close at hand. The forest seemed louder than before, every crack and snap echoing. The metal box sat on the table, a silent, dark presence. Around midnight, the noises started again. Soft shuffling, dragging sounds just outside. My breath hitched as I grabbed the flashlight and shone it through the windows. The beam landed on a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A man, tall, with a coat that blended into the shadows. His face was obscured, but his eyes reflected the light briefly. He didn't move, just stood watching. I didn't call out, didn't make a sound. The figure turned and disappeared into the woods. I locked all doors and windows, moving silently to prepare for dawn. In the morning, I searched outside. The man's footprints were everywhere, around the cabin, circling close. No tracks leading away, just a perimeter. That day, I decided to open the metal box. I found an old rusty crowbar in my bag and pried the lock open with effort. Inside was a small notebook and a few photos, all worn and dirty. The photos showed the cabin years ago when it was new and people smiling in front of it. But there were other photos too, men with weapons, camping gear, and maps marked with red circles. The notebook was filled with handwritten notes about hunting spots, trails, and warnings about trespassers. The more I read, the clearer it became. The cabin wasn't just a place to relax. It had been used for something else, hunting, or something more serious. As the days passed, the man didn't show again, but I knew he was still out there, watching. I packed up my things early, locking the cabin behind me, taking the box with me. The drive back was tense. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I imagined eyes in the trees. When I finally reached the town, I went to the sheriff's office and handed over the photos and notebook. They knew about the man, a local who had been living off the grid, wary of strangers, known to patrol the woods and intimidate anyone near his territory. They assured me the man was under watch, and the cabin was being checked regularly now. I still think about that place sometimes, the quiet, the dark, the feeling of being watched. But I also know I did the right thing. The cabin is safe now, and I'm safe too. I learned something important from that trip. Sometimes, the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but real people and the secrets they hide. The forest doesn't forgive trespassers lightly, and some places have shadows that don't come from the night, but from the living.